Well, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name's Roseanne. I'm with Real Progressives, and my time here in Boulder City, Nevada, tells me it's exactly 2 o'clock, and I would like to get into this information today as quickly as possible. So, the first thing I'd like to do is introduce to everyone the gentleman who was the spark that made this happen. And his name's Todd Kelly. He lives in Lexington, Kentucky. And we got to meet, probably sometime in December. And before you knew it, here we are having a webinar with none other than Fadhel Kaboub. So before I introduce Fadhel for today's webinar, I'd like to have Todd Kelly share a few moments with you regarding how he came to know MMT. Todd, take it away.
Thanks, Roseanne, and thanks, Fadhel, for doing this. I appreciate it. Well, it's a pretty familiar story, as I've heard other people tell it as well. I was sitting around the table in 2007, 2008, and I was getting an explanation of the subprime crisis. And it was explained to me as a borrowing problem. And there were some details. It was a pretty good conversation, but I came away thinking, that doesn't really sound right to me. It doesn't really jive. So I started digging a little bit and came across Bill Black at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. And Bill Black taught me that no, surprise, it was a lending problem. And it was a lending fraud problem. And it was the way he put it, it was an accounting control fraud. So I started learning about mortgage-backed securities and collateralized debt obligations and credit defaults, and I kept digging some more. And I mean, this painted a picture of basically the financialization of our economy and how this was kind of the apotheosis of that kind of activity. So I came across Michael Hudson, his writings, also from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. And then I started coming across these strange ideas about how the government really doesn't need our taxes for spending, and how we don't really owe China anything. How what we call the national debt is really just the money supply. It's really our national wealth. And a couple of other insights that MMT provided. I know that I saw a video or two from Randall Ray. I probably had to listen to it and watch it 17 or 18 times. I did the same thing with Warren Mosler, 15 or 16 times of the same video. And finally it clicked. And I thought, wow, this is really good. This makes sense. I can understand it. And so here we are. And I met Roseanne and pestered her a little bit, and pestered Fadhel a little bit, and they were gracious enough to help organize this webinar. And that's
I'm so glad you're here.
That's the short version.
That's the short. You know, we should have a webinar one of these days of tons and tons of MMTers telling their story in 3 to 5 minutes or less. Okay, we'll do it. We'll do it. Todd, again.
Well, one thing more I'd like to say.
Go ahead.
So the latest thing I've been thinking about is, so we have a money system and it has a design, and it seems to me that there's a thing called access to the money system and the benefits of the access to the money system. I'm thinking about who gets those benefits and who doesn't, and who has access to that system and who doesn't. And so that's that's kind of what is occupying me right now. And thanks a lot for that.
Thank you, my dear. Thank you. And now I want to get to introducing a young gentleman that I've had the pleasure of breaking bread with a couple of times. And I'm just so glad that I got to meet him and know about his work. And you'll get to experience that for yourself today. So by way of introduction, Fadhel Kaboub is an assistant professor of economics at Denison University in Ohio. He's also research associate at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, you know, the one in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that one. And the Levy Economics Institute of Bard College in New York, the Center for Full Employment and Price Stability, and the International Economic Policy Institute in Ontario, Canada, I'm sorry. And last but not least, Fadhel is also the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. And we'll put the link in the chat so you can make sure you follow them on Twitter and check out the site. And my final word is, when I heard Fadhel about 2 years ago utter the words caring economy, he had me hook, line, and sinker. And that means, for you young folks who may not understand what that means, he had me hooked. And now I'm so pleased to introduce to you Professor Fadhel Kaboub. Fadhel, take it away.
Thank you, Roseanne, and thank you, Todd and John and everybody at RP for hosting this event and for the nice introduction. What I want to talk about today is MMT and its policy implications. I'm hoping that you will not need to go through this 17 times. I know some of these ideas will be sort of a tough pill to swallow, but I'll try to simplify and break this down to all of you, especially those of you who are introduced to MMT for the first time today, so we can mobilize and organize our people to get what we deserve, to get what we can afford, to get the caring economy that all of us deserve. So with that, let me start with a few general observations about where we are today and what we need to do. And I'm going to start by saying that we need to be radicals. And I know this is sometimes perceived as a dirty word these days in the political context in which we live, but I really mean it in the linguistic sense of the term. Radical meaning going to the roots of the problem. And for me, if we're not going to the roots of the problem, we're introducing simply superficial treatment to the problem. And superficial treatment doesn't get rid of the issue. It simply reproduces the same problem. So that's how I use the term radicals, and I'll try to demonstrate why it's important to do this in a radical way. First, we have deep structural problems, and it's a long list that most of you are familiar with: the climate crisis, an inequality crisis, socioeconomic exclusion crisis, a dysfunctional political system, and yet the major political parties and political leaders we have in DC and other places around the country are telling us we need small, incremental, bipartisan solutions that will be acceptable by the political class, the political elite. And to me, those are what I call superficial, status quo, reproducing solutions. So we can't afford small, incremental solutions. We have systemic problems, structural problems. They need to be addressed at the roots. So radical as opposed to superficial change. And here, superficial change, as I'll argue today, is unaffordable. It is actually too costly for us to keep reproducing those problems. And Martin Luther King Jr., in the context of the civil rights movement, and I'm paraphrasing here, he said, "I have no time for the tranquilizing drug of gradualism and incrementalism." And he was referring to the civil rights movement. Similarly, today, I think we have no time for the tranquilizing drug of gradualism and incrementalism when it comes to those structural problems that I listed earlier. And if we go with incremental bipartisan solutions, to me, those are the textbook formula for the status quo, for reproducing the same problems. And that's unacceptable, that's unaffordable. So to me, the biggest policy implication of understanding MMT is this multi-pronged, transformative policy framework that we call the Green New Deal, that tackles all of these problems simultaneously as opposed to tackling them one at a time on a small scale. So why we need a Green New Deal? Because we have multiple roots of these structural problems: the inequality crisis, socioeconomic exclusion, the opioid crisis for many of us, especially in this part of the country, but it's really a national problem. Low-paying jobs, especially in rural areas, but it's really across the country. Unaffordable housing, education, health, all of these things need to be addressed at the same time. I'll give you an example. If we say we're going to start by creating jobs, let's say jobs to produce solar and wind energy. And we come to a place like where I live here in Ohio, or anywhere in Appalachia, in Kentucky, in West Virginia, and we say, we're going to create these renewable energy jobs. Now we're going to recruit people and we're going to pay them decent wages. That's a good start, but it's not sufficient. Why? Because the individuals you want to hire would be ideally locals. And if the local workforce is dealing with so many additional problems, such as transportation. You can't get to work if there's no transportation. You can't get to work on time if you have family issues, if you have housing issues, if you're dealing with mental health issues, family breakdown, an opioid addiction. All of this requires an entire ecosystem of uplifting services and investments that will actually allow us to thrive as a community and rebuild from within. And that's why the Green New Deal offers all of this comprehensive investment in health and education and housing and energy and transportation and so on, so we can rebuild on a solid foundation across the board, not one piece at a time. So what is the Green New Deal? Fundamentally, it must be funded federally at the federal level. We can't put this financial burden on states and municipalities because they can't afford it. We know that for a fact. It's not just because of the pandemic, because the scale of these investments needs to come from the federal government, not local states and municipalities, which means no additional tax burden on local residents. We're not increasing the levies for infrastructure or for school districts and so on. So federal funding, but local implementation in a decentralized way. And this is really important to revive and go back to participatory democracy, getting local communities to decide what the priorities are. So we're talking about participatory budgeting, participatory planning, participatory auditing, participatory everything at the local level, because nobody in Washington, D.C. is going to be able to figure out exactly what each community needs and what the priority lists are. So local implementation and management of these projects is extremely important. It needs to be rural and urban. We can't just create the jobs in San Francisco and tell people, learn how to code and move to San Francisco. We want to create jobs where people are in their own communities, to rebuild their own communities, and especially in rural areas. It needs to be inclusive, it needs to be just, and it needs to be restorative. Inclusive in the sense that we shouldn't reproduce the mistakes of the New Deal of the 1930s, which excluded African Americans in many parts of the country, because that was a different area, though we had different problems. We need to learn from those mistakes and truly create a Green New Deal that's inclusive. It needs to be just, and this is an important concept. I know a lot of people don't like this concept of just transition because it comes with an old baggage from the 1990s when people were told we'll sign this free trade deal with the NAFTA free trade deal, and we'll have a just transition for workers. They'll transition to new jobs. And then what happened? All the jobs left, and we threw people under the bus in the name of just transition. So empty promises. I insist the Green New Deal must include a true just transition, especially for fossil fuel workers, but for other workers that will be displaced in this massive transformation of the economy, including workers in the health insurance industry. If we truly transition to a more efficient healthcare system that doesn't require a lot of middleman types of jobs pushing paperwork for insurance companies, then we also need a transition plan for those workers who will be displaced. Same thing for truckers and fossil fuel workers and so on. And here, it's very important to dig into the details of what we mean by a just transition, because it is not fair or acceptable to tell a fossil fuel worker today who makes maybe six-figure salary and is probably in their late 40s, maybe early 50s, to tell them that we're going to decarbonize, we're going to end the fossil fuel extraction, and we're offering you a job guarantee at $15 an hour plus benefits. That's just not a just transition. So we need a job guarantee that actually keeps the same wage and benefits package, at least for the senior workers in the fossil fuel industry, so that we can grandfather people in, underwritten by the federal government, because the federal government can't afford this. So we can transition people with their retirement benefits and their wages. And if there's a training program needed, all of this needs to be included in a truly just transition. And then finally, it needs to be restorative in the sense that it needs to restore the social fabric, the economic fabric, especially again in rural areas and parts of the country that have struggled the most over the last 2 or 3 decades. And I keep referring to the Appalachian region, which is where I am. I'm in Ohio. And I'm also part of a network of 100+ organizations in Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Kentucky who are calling for and have proposed a blueprint called Reimagine Appalachia. And you can think of it as a mini Green New Deal for the region, with investments primarily in broadband infrastructure, modernizing the grid, including also investing in clean transportation, investing or restarting the CCC administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, to do environmental cleanup, environmental restoration, coal mine reclamation investments, waterway cleanups and so on, but also to invest in regenerative agriculture in the region. So that will be the modern day CCC for our generation. Investing in renewable energy production locally and investing in the manufacturing of green technology in the region. So this is really in short what the Reimagine Appalachia blueprint is and what all of this coalition of organizations are pushing for. And I think somebody maybe will drop the link to Reimagine Appalachia on in the chat so you can check it out. And I'm happy to answer questions later about it. So this is what we're talking about, a true investment in restoring the economic fabric, the social fabric for communities from within, not telling people to move out of state and go find the job somewhere else. It needs to be comprehensive and permanent in the sense that investments, we can't say, well, let's do first the green investments first, just the clean energy, and then do health, and then do education, and then because we can't afford, comprehensive meaning needs to be all the above at once. And this needs to be a permanent investment, permanent change, not kind of 3 to 5 years, and then we say, oh, we're done. We've done enough improvements. Now we can go back to the old ways. So this has to be, a new way forward for the country. So the big question that MMT answers and makes possible for us is the question of how do we pay for it? all of this ambitious program, massive, transformative, and expensive set of policies, can we afford it? And this is what the mainstream understanding tells us. Mainstream politics, economics, the media, they tell us the government is broke. We're running out of dollars. The rich will never agree to pay higher taxes to fund all of this stuff. The national debt, we're told, is a burden on future generations. This is going to explode the national debt. And then, of course, we're told this is going to cause inflation or hyperinflation. And you hear the references to Zimbabwe and Venezuela and Weimar Republic and wheelbarrows worth of cash and hyperinflation type of thing. And then other people say, well, we need to borrow billions of dollars and trillions of dollars from China. We can't afford that, right? And what I'm inviting you to do today after this presentation, after you understand some of the basics of MMT, is to be able to call their bluff when you hear any of these statements about we can't afford it. And we're going to change the narrative and flip it on its head and actually make the case for all of these investments and make the case that they're actually affordable. Make the case that the cost of doing nothing is actually much, much more expensive than the cost of doing the right thing. The cost of doing the right thing, meaning the Green New Deal investments. I'll show you today that it's actually cheaper to do the Green New Deal, that ambitious, expensive program. That's actually the cheap version. What we're doing right now, which is nothing, is unaffordable, is too expensive, right? So even if you're fiscally conservative, if you're worried about spending too much money, let me tell you this, we're already spending too much money and we're not getting the jobs, we're not getting the health benefits, we're not saving the planet, we're not investing in our future. That's what we're doing today. That's the expensive part. So how did we pay for World War II, which was a very expensive, ambitious program, right? And it came right after the Great Depression, the most miserable time in US history. There was no money to be taxed. There was no money to be borrowed during the Great Depression to spend all of this massive amount of money to build for World War II. Did we go into World War II with the gradualist, incrementalist approach? Did anybody suggest at the time that maybe we should send 10,000 troops and see if we can defeat the Nazis? And then the next month, maybe send 25,000 troops and see if we can beat them? Well, of course not. You need to do this massive commitment all at once to win the war, which is what the US did. So the question is, how did we pay for it? How did the US go from the most miserable economic time where we were told there was no money to all of a sudden spend massive amounts of money without bankrupting the country, without causing hyperinflation, without turning into a communist nation, and by building this massive infrastructure that was the stepping stone for the post-war boom in the US economy? Let me ask you a similar question. How did we pay for the CARES Act? We don't have to go this far, that far back in history. Who did we tax for the CARES Act? Who did we borrow from, right? The $1.9 trillion that we're going to spend in the next few days that Congress is currently, voting on, are they saying who they're taxing or who they're borrowing from? Absolutely not. This is not how we think of federal spending. This is not how we think of national priorities. We're sold this idea that we need to get the tax money from somewhere or need to borrow it from somewhere in order to pay for programs. But when it comes to national issues of high priority, like World War II, like other wars, like the CARES Act and dealing with the pandemic, those questions are off the table. And the entire focus shifts on the real things that matter, which is the following. And this is really what MMT does. It shines this bright light on the things that actually matter. And it turns out that finding the money is never the issue, because the way the US federal government functions is the following. 535 elected officials gather in Washington, D.C. and set the priorities for national spending. They have the power of the purse. If they vote with the majority to approve the spending, that's how the money is created. It's really about finding the votes, as Stephanie Kelton says. It's not about finding the money. And the CARES Act, if you remember almost a year ago, when the CARES Act vote came, when the moment came for the vote, 100% of our representatives voted in favor of it. They were missing maybe 3 or 4 people who were either had COVID and couldn't be there, or were exposed to COVID and had to be quarantined. But it wasn't even an issue. So the issue was always about finding the real productive resources to make this happen. So during World War II, for example, we were worried about finding enough resources to build tanks and airplanes and equipment for the war machine. So what we had to do was to take the city of Detroit, for example, and shut down the production of automobiles completely and shift to producing military equipment only. And we created lots and lots of jobs and paid people decent wages to support the war effort. We had to bring even more people into the labor force, women, older people, even younger people, retired people back into the labor force to work double and triple shifts, 3 shifts to keep up with the war effort. So it was a massive employment program. This was kind of military employment at the time. But what the concern was finding the raw materials that we actually need to build the tanks and airplanes, which means we couldn't use rubber for other purposes because we needed plenty of rubber for military trucks and jeeps and things like that. So that was the idea, is to find the raw materials, the skilled people. The good news about that is that, you know, skilled people are producible too. We can train people on the job. And that's exactly what we did during World War II. We didn't say, oh, women have no experience in manufacturing or in flying airplanes. We trained them on the job. We trained older people, younger people, and people who came from completely different careers. We made it happen. The major concern after the training and organizing the workforce and so on was, what will those workers do with these good wages that we're paying them, right? Naturally, if you're a middle-class person, you earned a good income, you're going to go spend it, right? It's a free country. You can buy whatever you want. You can buy a car, you can buy a new house, you can buy clothing, entertainment, whatever. That became the concern. What if those workers now go on a shopping spree, and what if they want to buy more cars and we don't have any new cars available because we shut down Detroit? We're producing tanks, no cars. What if they want to buy new housing? We have no workers available to build new homes because they're either fighting the war or building tanks and airplanes for the military. So that became the major concern. That was the thing that was going to cause inflation. It's the next wave of spending, the increased demand for consumer goods that were not available because we didn't have people to produce them, because we prioritized the war. So the risk of inflation is always the thing that worries us. And that's the thing that worries MMTers today, is what is the risk of inflation? So for people who say MMT doesn't care about inflation, they just say print money and all that, nonsense. MMTers are obsessed with the risk of inflation. So how did we deal with the risk of inflation during World War II? We offered, as part of the war effort, we as in the US Treasury, started selling freedom bonds, war bonds, treasury bonds. And those bonds were not sold before the war, they were sold during the war. In other words, the war was already paid for when Congress voted to approve it. The war bonds came in during the war as an option that those workers now have, that says, you workers have lots of cash. We want you to abstain from consumption right now. Save that money until after the war. Here are US Treasury bonds, war bonds, or freedom bonds. Buy them today. Give us your cash. We promise to pay you back plus interest in 10 years, 20 years, whatever the maturity of those bonds were, which meant no additional consumption was adding pressure on the economy, which meant no inflationary pressure on the economy. That's how we manage the inflation risk. Of course, we had some price controls for key commodities, some rationing for key commodities, because we physically needed those things for the war. And it was a way also of managing inflation. So that's how we managed inflation, and that's the real constraint on the economy. It's the risk of inflation. The same is going to be true today with the risk of inflation from this massive potential transformation under a Green New Deal program. And we can include anything we want in the Green New Deal. It doesn't matter what those things are. What matters is, do we have the skilled people, the resources, and the productive capacity to increase production without causing inflation. And now let me zoom in on what MMT is in particular, now that we know what the parameters of the policy options are. So MMT focuses on the concept of monetary sovereignty. And when I say monetary sovereignty, we're talking about the federal government has monetary sovereignty. The state of Ohio, the state of Kentucky, the state of New York, they don't have monetary sovereignty because they're just like you and I. They're users of the currency. They can't create the US dollar. They don't have the power of the purse. They operate under budget constraints like you and I. So the federal government issues its own currency, the US dollar. The federal government collects taxes in US dollars. It only issues government bonds denominated in US dollars. So the federal government, the US Treasury, never promises to pay you back in a foreign currency. It's all in US dollars. And the federal government, the US dollar, operates under a flexible exchange rate system. In other words, the US dollar is not fixed to gold or silver or any foreign currency. And you'll see other developing countries, they fix their currency to the dollar or to the British pound or whatever. So because we have these four features in the US system, we happen to have a very high degree of monetary sovereignty, which allows us a substantial fiscal spending capacity that I argue will afford a very generous and comprehensive Green New Deal, as I'll show in a minute. So the key distinction here between currency issuer and currency users, you and I are users of the currency. When I say you and I, it's consumers, it's businesses, it's your local state and municipal government agencies. We're constrained by our revenues. So I have to work hard, earn an income first in order to spend. I can borrow up to a certain point from a bank or from a friend, but then that's it. That's the limit of how much I can spend. And then I have a real debt, a real burden, financial burden that I need to pay off by working harder, earning more money, spending less, or all the above. That's how I operate. That's how you operate. This is the financial prudence that all of us have been taught, by our parents and grandparents. Same thing if you're running a business. You can borrow up to a limit, but you really have to earn the income, the revenue, in order to spend on whatever the business needs to spend on. States and municipalities, they collect tax revenues from the residents. They can borrow up to a certain point by issuing municipal bonds or state bonds. But that's it. Beyond a certain point, the state or the municipality or the city can't really borrow unlimited amounts. The federal government operates in a completely different universe. That's why we focus on the currency issuer, because the federal government has the power of the purse. It can create money into existence, unlike the rest of us. So that's the key distinction. So when I say MMT and the Green New Deal and all of these policy ideas in terms of what the government can spend, don't try this at home. This is for sovereign governments. And because we're talking about sovereign governments, it's important to make a distinction. Not all governments are equally sovereign in terms of monetary sovereignty. There are different degrees of monetary sovereignty. So when you hear people saying, oh, Greece tried this and it doesn't work, or Venezuela tried this and it doesn't work, let me clarify. We have a spectrum of monetary sovereignty. On this end of the spectrum, I don't know if you can see the cursor here, I lost it. Some countries have no monetary sovereignty whatsoever. I'm talking about a country like Ecuador, for example, that literally uses the US dollar. It just doesn't have its own currency. So it's literally a user of a foreign currency. That's a country that doesn't have any monetary sovereignty. It's the extreme end of the spectrum. On this end of the spectrum, you have countries like the US, Canada, Japan, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, you name it. These are countries with very high degrees of monetary sovereignty, which means they have plenty of spending capacity. They don't have any foreign debt denominated in foreign currencies. And then you have most developing countries are kind of in between. And what determines where you stand on that spectrum is how badly you need to fix your currency to the dollar or to the British pound or the Japanese yen or the euro, and how much debt your government owes in foreign currencies. So most developing countries have debt denominated in dollars and British pounds and euros. So that determines how much monetary sovereignty you have. And of course, the goal, and this is what MMT provides also to developing countries, is strategic policies that allow you to acquire over time higher and higher degrees of monetary sovereignty that will actually allow you to be more generous in your investments and your commitment to fighting climate change, poverty, inequality, and so on. So that's just to remind everybody that when people say Venezuela and Greece and you know, the examples of Zimbabwe and all of that, none of that is relevant to the US, because we're talking about the opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of what the possibilities are. So here's what the mainstream approach tells us. It tells us that government spending is limited by tax revenues. This is kind of the most fiscally conservative approach, kind of the Tea Party approach. Then we're told, well, maybe there's a little bit of room of borrowing up to a certain limit, but beyond that, we can't really increase government spending. We have to cut spending somewhere else if we're going to spend, and we need to pay down the debt and things like that. What MMT says is that there's this additional spending capacity, this yellow, bright yellow space. That's not unlimited, it's not infinite. Notice it's limited by that red bar, which is the risk of inflation. So for MMT, the question becomes, what's the size of that additional fiscal spending capacity? And where does the risk of inflation stop us, right? So it's really about estimating that space. So it's important then to identify what determines the risk of inflation, because that's the real limit to our capacity. And to me, the risk of inflation has to do with two potential sources. One is the lack of productive capacity. In other words, if we literally run out of skilled people, machinery, equipment, raw materials, and yet we want to produce more, we want to demand more of those items, we're going to cause inflation. The good news about productive capacity is that it's producible. We can actually train more doctors and nurses. We can build more hospitals. With the know-how that we have, we can build more capacity, and it creates millions of jobs, and it allows us to actually increase the size of this additional fiscal spending capacity. So that bright yellow space, we can actually increase it by investing more in our capabilities and our productive capacity. So that's the easy part. We know how to do these things with strategic investments and education and training and capacity building. The second one is a bit more complicated, and I think this will be interesting for many of people to learn here, which is what I call the abusive market power and price setting behavior. So we have key players in the economy. Think of health insurance companies. Think of big pharma, big tech, your telecom companies, your internet providers, companies that dominate markets, that can raise prices for no good reason, just simply because they can, because they dominate the market. So this abusive price setting behavior is not something that we can get rid of by not spending more, by not having a Green New Deal. You only eliminate the risk of inflation from that market power by taxing and regulating their market power out of existence. That's how we tame the risk of inflation. And if we do that successfully, antitrust laws and so on, then we can take that red bar and push it further out. We can actually stretch that bright yellow space to make it even larger. And that's how we can afford additional spending capacity on things that matter, like the Green New Deal policies that I suggested. So this is really a question of democracy, this point about inflation. Why? Because that abusive market power that I'm talking about, who's in charge of taxing and regulating that abusive market power? It's the 535 people we send to Washington, D.C. We call them lawmakers, we call them regulators. Their job is to tax and regulate abusive industries. The problem is, if they're funded and elected, brought to you by super PACs, then it's unlikely, for the majority of them, it's unlikely that they're going to bite the hands that feed them. So do we have a government of the people, by the people, for the people, which is what democracy is supposed to be? Or do we have a government of the super PACs, by the super PACs, for the super PACs? This is a question that all of us have to deal with, right? And if we want to restore the democratic process, then we'll be able to restore a more competitive market system, a less abusive price setting behavior, and a democratic system. And that's why MMT shines this bright light on how the system currently works. So when people say, oh, how do we implement MMT? MMT is not something you implement. MMT is this bright light that we're shining on this slide right here that says, look, there's a world of possibilities. And it's currently being suffocated by the lack of productive capacity because we're not investing enough in productive capacity. And it's further suffocated by abusive market power, by corruption. And that's why we talk about taking money, getting money out of politics. It's because of this. So if we remove those forces that suffocate our capacity, then we're opening up a world of possibilities for a more sustainable, more just, more equitable, more prosperous system for all of us. So that's really the core. It's not, MMT is not something to be introduced. MMT is just this bright light that I'm shining right here that says, look, there are possibilities. There are so many other options on the table that we're currently not taking. Why? Because we're accepting the system as is. We're told that we can't increase spending, but we don't know why we can't increase spending. We just have this myth in the back of our heads that says, oh, if we increase more spending, it's going to cause inflation, so let's not spend more. Whereas what I'm saying is there's actually a way to eliminate that risk of inflation and to allow us additional spending, but it has to come with these two key strategies, which is increase productive capacity in key areas where we actually have shortages, especially in healthcare and infrastructure, renewable energy, education, housing, affordable housing, and so on. And then deal with the abusive market power that's suffocating the system today. So that's really the one of the core messages I have here. And that's really a paradigm shift in terms of how we as citizens think about the possibilities, how elected officials think about the possibilities. This is a game changer, right? So what we do as a result of that is we decouple, we separate spending from taxing at the federal level. So we spend on the national priorities. We set our priorities straight and say, we can afford this spending. And then the taxing comes in for other purposes. It's not taxing because we need their money or their permission to have a Green New Deal. So tax polluters because we want to reduce pollution, because we want to decarbonize. Tax speculation because we want to reduce financial instability and speculative behavior, not because we need their money or their permission to have better education or better infrastructure. Tax extreme excessive wealth because we want to save democracy from oligarchy, because we want to protect the democratic system, reduce their power and influence in politics, not because we need their money or their permission to produce clean air, clean water, and clean soil. Tax to reduce this excessive, abusive market power, right? Those are extremely important goals. Tax to reduce inequality, that's an important goal too, right? Not because we need the revenues for it. So these are the goals that MMT immediately suggests, that we can decouple the spending and taxing. And we're saying both of these things are important. They just don't need to be linked to each other. Because the traditional way most of us think about taxing and spending, we say, oh, we need to tax the rich in order to afford healthcare. We need to tax Wall Street in order to afford education. We need to tax oil companies in order to afford clean energy. And here we're saying, no, 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 we don't need their money or their permission. We're still going to tax them for these other purposes, but we're going to spend on the priorities because the priorities matter. So that's an important also paradigm shift in the way we think about these priorities. So to me, the national priorities come in three layers. Number one, universal public services, by which I mean green infrastructure, Medicare for all, health, homes for all, home guarantees, education for all, including vocational training, childcare, all the things that we all know middle-class America needs, and we know that we can afford. Right? These are the right investments. So universal public services. The second layer comes in the form of a job guarantee, a federal job guarantee. And I encourage all of you, maybe somebody will drop this in the chat. Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley last week, or maybe 10 days ago, introduced a federal job guarantee resolution that encourage all of you to call your senators and representatives and encourage them to endorse it and fight for an actual legislation. So a job guarantee at a living wage with benefits for people who want to work. And we have millions of people who want to work. And this is pre-pandemic. Obviously, the pandemic made the situation worse. In the pandemic situation, a lot of people started telling me, oh, how do you want a job guarantee when people have to stay home? Shouldn't we just give them money to stay home? And for me, the most important job during the pandemic was actually staying home. So that should be a paid job too. Once we deal with the pandemic and deal with the health issues, then we can, bring people safely back to the workplace and introduce the job guarantee the way most of us describe it. But for now, if people can work remotely, and there's quite a bit of job guarantee jobs that can be done remotely, that can be done safely with social distancing and proper sanitation and so on. But that's the second layer for our agenda. And that is an extremely important component of the Green New Deal, because that's how you guarantee a just transition for workers who will be displaced in healthcare or in the fossil fuel industry, the transportation system, and so on. A job guarantee is a core feature of the Green New Deal. It's not just a nice add-on. It is there because that's the right thing to do. The third layer, after universal public services and job guarantee for people who want to work, a generous income support for people who can't work, right? So nobody's left behind in the system. And again, my point is that we can afford all of these things without a slippery slope into communism, without causing hyperinflation, without bankrupting the country. We can afford all of these things. So what does mainstream economics and mainstream economists say about inflation? Because that's the main constraint. And I hope that now you have a clear idea of what the MMT approach to inflation is. Here's what mainstream economists have been saying about inflation the last few years. The Fed has no reliable theory of inflation. Translation in plain English, we have no idea what causes inflation. We're clueless. Here's the European Central Bank. To explain this chart here, this is the actual inflation in the last 10 years or so in the European Union. These dotted lines are the inflation forecasts by the ECB at any given point in time. They're always expecting higher and higher inflation based on their perception of inflation, because they think if there's more money in the system, if there's more quantitative easing, more deficits and national debt, that must cause inflation. And they've been consistently wrong for at least a decade. I can show you similar pictures for other central banks around the world. It's ridiculous how wrong, how misleading their ideas about inflation and what causes inflation. MMT has the right track record that actually explains what causes inflation, which means our argument about we have plenty of spending capacity before we hit the inflation barrier is really the right framework for policy action. So to zoom in on US inflation in particular. Now, a lot of you think, well, what are they talking about on TV when they say inflation is low and we need higher inflation? Because your bills are getting more expensive, your cost of living is getting more expensive, but this thing they talk about on TV is not reflecting what you're experiencing. The drivers of inflation in the US are four major areas. And all of you probably know this because you pay your bills and you know what it's like to pay for healthcare. You know what it's like to pay for education, especially if you have young kids going to college. You know what it's like to pay for housing. And this is including in rural areas, by the way. Housing is not that cheap in rural areas. Energy and transportation. These are the four areas that currently are actually the big drivers of inflation in the US. We have other items that are actually deflating, so they're getting cheaper. So think of all the imported cheap plastics and textiles that we get from the rest of the world. All the electronic stuff is getting, much more, cheaper, but also more sophisticated. So we have certain items that deflate, certain items that inflate. These are the drivers of inflation. And that's why by design in the Green New Deal proposal that we have, we include the solutions that will directly target those drivers of inflation. So when we say Medicare for all, it means building productive capacity and taxing and regulating the abusive market power in the industry. When we say college training for all, and college and vocational training for all, and state schools and public schools. This is also about increasing the productive capacity, investing in people so that we have the skilled population for the jobs of the future. When we say home guarantee, when we say rent control, it's about increasing the availability of public housing, affordable housing, and controlling the abusive price setting behavior, slum lords, and so on. When we say decarbonize the economy and the whole set of investments under the Green New Deal, it's about transforming the energy and transportation system, not just by building a clean alternative, but also taxing and regulating the abusive market power that oil companies and energy companies and utilities have in the system. So for me, my worst nightmare would be, implementing something like a Green New Deal framework without doing this, in which case we're going to spend a lot of money and we're not going to deal with the risks of inflation, with the drivers of inflation. And then they're going to say, look, we told you this Green New Deal is going to be unaffordable, is causing inflation. That's why it's important we include these programs, not because this is my favorite shopping list for public policy. There is a very strategic reason for each one of these. They just happen to be good things for society anyway, but they also target the risk of inflation from the beginning. So the name of the game is focus on market power and focus on building productive capacity in strategic areas of the economy. And these happen to be the major categories. So when they say we can't afford it, I usually say, I agree. We can't afford the current system. We can't afford the status quo. They usually say we can't afford it, referring to the Green New Deal. When they say the deficit is too big, I also say, I agree. The infrastructure deficit is too big. The educational deficits are too big. The healthcare deficits are too big. These are the deficits that matter, right? When they say the national debt is too high, I say, yeah, the national debt to future generations in terms of natural resources, clean water, and when they say the debt, I say, well, yeah, debt to future generations in terms of real resources, not this thing we call the national debt. When they say it's the climate debt that matters, right? It's the reparations debt that matters. It's the student loan debt crisis that matters. These are the deficits and debts that matter. So it's really about shifting the narrative. And this is, again, to repeat my point from earlier, we want to shift the narrative to actually argue that this is not affordable. This is too expensive, too painful on so many fronts. These are the things that we can't afford, right? So the cost of doing nothing, which is the forest fires and the floods in the Midwest and all of this pain that we're going through and that we're going to experience more of this as climate change intensifies. These are the things that we can't afford. So the cost of investing in a Green New Deal, the way I described it today, is actually the cheaper, healthier version that creates millions of jobs, improves our quality of life. The status quo, is unaffordable because we're paying way too much and getting nothing out of it in terms of jobs or quality of life. So shifting the narrative and shifting the metric, one of the best ways to do this, because we need a metric for these things. The current metric that we use is economic growth. We say if we produce economic growth, it will create the wealth, and that wealth will allow us to thrive as a society. That wealth will allow us to pay for all of these generous programs you want. And I think that's a trap, because when we measure economic growth, we measure it with this thing we call GDP, gross domestic product, which is the sum total, the dollar amount of all goods and services we produced annually, which means if we have an oil spill and we spend $300 million to clean it up, GDP goes up by $300 million. And it gets celebrated on TV. They say, yay, economic growth. When we have more people going to hospitals because of breathing problems, because of asthma, because of cancer treatment from pollution, all of that money spent on prescription drugs and hospital visits, all of it shows up as more GDP has been created, and it gets celebrated. We say, yay, more, 2% growth in GDP, let's celebrate it. But of course, GDP is going up, but our quality of life is going down. If we build a $300 million prison at the state level, GDP goes up. Why? Because there's more crime, because there's more incarceration, more opioid crisis. All of these things are showing up today as positive numbers in GDP to be celebrated on TV as economic growth when it's actually destroying our quality of life. The White House under President Obama started a study, and then it was released under the Trump administration, a study on the cost of the opioid crisis in the last 4 years. It's a 4-year period that they looked at. $2.5 trillion cost of dealing with the opioid crisis. So when I say the cost of doing nothing is too expensive, that's what I mean. Tally up the cost of all of these negative effects, and you'll realize that we're spending so much money and getting more pain, more pollution, more crime, more suffering, no jobs, no improvement in quality of life. And what I'm suggesting is the cost of doing the right thing, which is the Green New Deal, is actually going to be cheaper. It's going to create millions of jobs, and it's going to lift up the quality of life. So what many ecological economists have done to change the metric that we use is to take the actual GDP statistics and then strip all of those negative effects out of it, like the cost of the opioid crisis, like the cost of cleaning up oil spills, like the cost of dealing with cancer treatment and all of these negative health effects. Once you take them out, you get the pure quality of life measure, which is what we call the genuine progress indicator. And if you look at the data for the US for the last several decades, this has been a flat line, essentially. No improvement in quality of life. And this is something that the average person sort of feels, but doesn't see on TV because there's no metric, there's no measure for it. So when you hear people saying, well, it feels like I haven't been getting ahead, I've been working and trying and doing, and it's just no improvement in quality of life. That's what they're talking about, because our quality of life is deteriorating with the kinds of spending that we're putting into the economy. And once you change the metric and change the narrative, all of those Green New Deal investments that we've been talking about for the last hour or so, all of those investments immediately pop up as the right thing to do if we wanted to use GPI as the right metric. So if you want to increase quality of life, those are the kinds of investments that will actually increase quality of life. So shifting the metric away from GDP to actual measure of quality of life is a no-brainer. This is not like political left or political right. Everybody wants better quality of life, and we need to shift the narrative to focus on this. And MMT opens up all these possibilities because now we know we can afford these things without going bankrupt, without causing any harm. So to close with a few remarks, we have less than 10 years to act on a massive scale to do this. 10 years not to think and plan and debate, 10 years to act on a massive scale. The climate crisis, the inequality crisis, and poverty, exclusion, injustice, all of these things call for urgent and bold policy action, not small, incremental, experimental, let's see how it goes, right? We can't afford that. The current policies on climate, on jobs, on inequality are too weak, too slow, too expensive, and ineffective. They don't even work, which means the current policies are actually dangerous because they're not helping us address the roots of the problems. They're simply reproducing the status quo and kind of applying Band-Aid solutions to these deep problems. So I believe that economic justice and climate justice via a living wage Green New Deal, the way I described it today, these policies are possible, desirable, and affordable. And what's not affordable, as I said, is the status quo. It's too expensive. It's not affordable. So once again, the cost of doing the right thing is actually much cheaper than the cost of doing nothing. And with that, I'm happy to take questions and engage in conversations with all of you. Thank you again.
Fadhel, thank you so much. And in the habit of sharing, when we have this video prepared after today's presentation, I will continue to share it just as I do with your 6-minute clip about how World War II was paid for. Can't ever share that enough. Okay, And we're going to respect folks' time. We're going to allow, let's say, about 30 minutes for questions. And Fadhel, I'll start with the first one. And it comes from Phil. And he wanted to know, what are your thoughts about the intersection of the federal job guarantee, like Ayanna Pressley is talking about, and the fight for 15?
Very good question. So um, I think one of the things that we need to be doing right now on the policy front is fight multiple battles at the same time. I'm all for fight for 15, but as many of you probably know, 15 is not high enough, right? It's kind of the floor, it's not the ceiling. As many of you have probably heard this phrase over the last few weeks. So if we're going to fight for 15 immediately, let's get the $15 an hour as soon as possible, and on day one start fighting for the next battle. I don't see it as something that comes in contrast to the job guarantee resolution that Ayanna Pressley has proposed. As a matter of fact, most of us, I think including Ayanna Pressley and her office, are in favor of a living wage job guarantee. If you read the resolution, it does include benefits, including vacation time, retirement benefits, health benefits, childcare benefits, everything is included there. So effectively, if we're successful at passing what's actually included in the job guarantee resolution and turn it into a bill and successfully implement it, we don't need to fight for 15, because this will be 15 plus the benefits, right? So I'm not saying we should stop fighting for 15. We should push on all fronts, because it's not like, you know, all the Democrats are in favor of $15 an hour or a job guarantee. We need to push on all fronts, because every time we campaign for something, we engage in educating the public and educating policymakers and their staffers, and we engage in setting their feet on fire when we mobilize. And that's how we push, you know, that's how we move the needle. So by all means, campaign on all fronts. We're pushing in the same direction. It's not competing or undermining each other's work.
That's great. I think we can never talk too much. That's just my opinion.
Right.
Thomas Clarkson wanted to know is if there's a group called Jobs Guarantee Now.
Yes.
Is that, do you think, the best organization to mobilize support for the jobs guarantee?
Yeah, so there are many organizations that have endorsed the job guarantee resolution. Before there was even a job guarantee resolution, there was a job guarantee now. There's obviously all the literature. So Policy Link, which is the institute out of California that hosted or kind of built this movement around the job guarantee now, including the Modern Money Network, GISP, and many of us in the MMT community are part of that. So I see them as a lead organization that's been doing a lot of good organizing and educational work to help us pull resources together and push for this resolution. They're, you know, good friends and doing great work.
And I think the bottom line is policy, not politician or
Right.
personality. Let's organize
absolutely.
around the policy, right?
Yeah. And if you read the job guarantee resolution that's been introduced and compare that to the core job guarantee MMT literature, it's pretty consistent, right? I mean, we can, you know, be picky about this phrase or that word, which we did in the drafting process. But I'm pretty satisfied with where we are now with the document. It's a great resource for anybody who wants to learn the basics of job guarantee. But it's now the heavy lifting comes in terms of educating every representative senator across the country to embrace it, to engage in and actually drafting a bill and passing it.
And exactly what you're doing. Delman Coates the other day said, education, education, education.
Right.
That's
Yeah, and to this point, if you remember during the presidential debates, the Democratic Party presidential debates, there was a question in one of the debates, and there was maybe 10 candidates on the stage or something like that. And the question was about the job guarantee. And almost every single candidate dodged the question. They didn't really answer, even though they had the job guarantee on their platform, but they didn't even know what it is. You know why they had the job guarantee on their platform? Because weeks before that, there was an opinion poll that was done, and it turns out that the job guarantee was the most popular policy in the country. So they had to include it. That's how politicians do it. They're followers, they're not leaders. So when the question was asked at the debate, almost nobody answered it. They all shifted to talking about investing in climate and creating jobs and all that, but they really don't know what a job guarantee is. Ayanna Pressley's resolution clearly explains what a job guarantee is and how it will be structured and why it's important to have it.
absolutely.
So definitely a lot of educational work, not just with the public, the media, but especially with politicians who can actually make this happen.
Yeah, there's a lot more of us than there are of them. We
Right.
need to speak up. Marshall Rovner wanted to ask, and this was like for the audience. He wanted to know, how does the Green New Deal differ from the proposed infrastructure plan that Trump had set up?
Yeah, well, I think after this presentation, you'll be able to make a clear comparison. So the infrastructure plan, under Republican administration or even the Biden infrastructure plan, which hopefully will see the light of day in the next few weeks, few months in Congress, you'll notice that you can call it a Green New Deal light or a truncated version of the Green New Deal because it doesn't include all of those features, especially on the health front, especially housing, especially all of these things. So it's a step in the right direction. I'm not going to say it's a disaster. Of course, it's an improvement if we invest in green infrastructure, especially if we are successful at pushing the Reimagine Appalachia infrastructure plans, which include modernizing the grid, renewable energy, broadband infrastructure, not just for the region, but for the whole country. That's a step in the right direction. And when I say this, I'm really thinking of what we did in the 1930s during the New Deal. There was no single bill called the New Deal that included all of those things. It came in several proposals within that 10-year period. So I'm hoping that this new infrastructure bill, which will be clean, which will be green and clean and at living wages with benefits, will be the first in a series of bills that will constitute what we would call in the future, those were the 10 years of the Green New Deal. That included a CCC, that included green infrastructure, that decarbonized the economy, that included healthcare for all, that tackled the issues of inequality and socioeconomic exclusion and housing and education on the jobs. So I'm not going to say we need one Green New Deal bill that includes everything. I'm willing to break it up into bits and pieces, but we have to have the vision, a comprehensive vision, and not to compromise and say we're just going to do the infrastructure, the rest of it will not deal with it. So I'll wait and I'll be critical after we see the infrastructure bill and after we see what comes next. If nothing is coming next, then we're in trouble. If the goal is just an infrastructure bill and we're going to stop there, I think that's going to be a major problem.
And with our new series, the new Untouchables, the Pecor Files, so many great things happened with banking regulations during that time as well. So my bottom line is always look to see what happened in history.
Right.
So you could, right?
Yeah, and Roseanne, you probably heard Bill Black say this. We can't have, we had this conversation a few weeks ago, and we came up with this phrase inspired by Bill Black's work, which is we can't have a Green New Deal without a clean New Deal. So we need to tackle the abusive market power and corruption in the system for reasons that I explained today, because that's the thing that suffocates our spending capacity. So a clean New Deal and a Green New Deal. And that's what the Pecora investigations did after the Great Depression. It really cleansed the system, from the financial markets abuse and the corruption in the system. And that's what opened up the possibilities for the New Deal of the 1930s, because it wasn't a popular program. They didn't want it.
So people did it before. We can do it again. Absolutely.
Exactly.
Dave had a question. He wanted to know, what is the MMT recommendation to Congress if the Green New Deal uses up all of our productive capacity 3 years into the deal?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the way I think about this is we don't start the spending and then wait for the problems to emerge. We plan strategically in advance. So what I would do is today is have a small army of economists and forecasters at the CBO, which we have a small army of people working for Congress. And instead of asking them, what will this bill cost us in terms of deficit and national debt and all, which is what they do these days, these nonsensical forecasts about the 20-year debt and deficits and all that, give them a real assignment and say, can you tell us what is the productive capacity of the economy? Can you tell us what is the risk of inflation from spending $2 trillion on green infrastructure over the next 3 years? And if they do the right thing in an MMT informed way, like what I described today, what they would do is they will assess two things. One is, do we have the productive capacity to the physical equipment and resources and skilled labor? Number two, they'll assess the market power and the concentration of power in these particular markets. But they will not just do it for the green infrastructure spending, because those workers who will actually build the infrastructure, they're going to go out and spend. They're going to spend on housing, on transportation, on food and entertainment. So they're going to have to assess, do we have the additional capacity to provide additional housing, additional transportation, additional resources for those workers? So that's the kind of research you need to do in advance. And if the answer to those questions is yes, we have plenty of capacity and there's no risk of inflation, then you can spend more. But if we get the answer from them and the CBO says, oh, if we spend this much, it's going to increase the demand for housing by 25%, and that's going to cause inflation in the real estate market because of abusive power, because of lack of rent controls, because of lack of construction materials and skilled workers, then we know what to do up front before we cause inflation. Then we go back to the drawing board and say, wait a minute, it looks like we need some taxing and regulation in the real estate market. Number two, it looks like we need to invest additional resources in building additional capacity for housing and affordable, rent control units and things like that. So that's the way I think about it. And if we do that the right way, then we're constantly spending with an eye towards inflation, with an eye towards the risk of inflation. So we actually never hit the inflation risk. We always plan for it and mitigate for it in advance. So that's how we can liberate that additional spending capacity.
Gee, we should be prepared, right? I mean, I don't want to be sarcastic, but we pay those people to do a job. People should be prepared. We have a question from Bob. Bear with me as I read it for you.
Sure.
For a Green New Deal, to be just and restorative,
Mhm.
does it not need to be at least somewhat non-inclusive, unbalanced, to level the legacy of bias, continuing to disadvantage people who were excluded from the benefits of the original New Deal and the GI Bill,
Mhm.
Black folk, Indigenous folks, other folks of color, and women and other gender excluded people. In other
Right.
words, doesn't Green New Deal need to pay real effective reparations to balance the historically created and maintained wealth gap?
Absolutely. So those of you who've heard me talk about this before, I've made the case for reparations, that we can afford reparations for Native Americans, for African Americans, and so on. And I've been calling for reparations globally for colonized people around the world. So from an MMT perspective, yes, we can afford reparations, and we can afford true reparations, because for me, reparations, and not just for me, for anybody in the reparations literature, we always say there's three components of reparations. First one is telling the truth, which is acknowledging the harm that's been made. Number two, if you tell the truth, you need to offer a public apology for the harm that's been inflicted on people. And then number three, you actually repair the damage. And when we say repair the damage, for me, it's two fundamental components. One is an actual monetary compensation, a penalty for the harm, repairing the harm that was done. But the second one, which is just as important, is repairing the broken structures that reproduced or created that harm, and kept the systemic inequality in place for generations after the end of slavery, for example. So when we talk about monetary compensation, that's direct compensation to individuals and communities. And when you talk about structural reparations, some of it can be to individuals, say, actual housing or land, or down payments towards starting a business, or down payments towards education or skills, or whatever it is, in kind structural reparations, but also overall reparations in terms of providing the healthcare, the infrastructure, the job guarantee that guarantees a transition, a just transition for everyone. So I don't want to speak for everybody in the Green New Deal movement, and I'm certainly not speaking on behalf of any politician. They don't really care for what I say in general. But if this was up to me, reparations would be part of the Green New Deal. Most of the discussions about the Green New Deal that I see around, unfortunately, don't include it. If you see my proposal for a global Green New Deal, I always call it the global Green New Deal with climate and colonial reparations. For me, there is no New Deal globally if it doesn't include reparations. That's where it. So count me in, absolutely.
Thank you so much. Of course, how can you do it for one place and not another? Doesn't make sense. Moving right along, Gil has a question. He wanted to know, Fadhel, how likely is it that Congress gets with the program and does the massive green deficit spending that we need to combat climate change before we go extinct? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I said this before, that's why I shifted quite a bit of my work over the last year to the global Green New Deal, because I'm pretty much convinced that even if we have the most ambitious Green New Deal in the US in the next 10 years, and Canada, and Japan, and the UK, and the EU, it's not going to be sufficient. We need everybody on board on a massive scale. For example, the European Union, they put out their plan for what they call a Green Deal. They don't call it Green New Deal, they call it Green Deal. or whatever you call it. It is their climate plan and their version of a Green New Deal. They're talking about $1 trillion, 1 trillion euros, I think, over the next 10 years. You know, that's like less than 2% of their GDP. It's like you're fighting a forest fire with a water pistol. That's their plan. And out of that $1 trillion, their commitment, actual government commitment, is actually a fraction of it. They're hoping to convince the private sector to invest in these things, to pay for the Green New Deal, their version of the Green New Deal. So it's a joke in terms of how much these governments are actually putting on the table to tackle the massive crisis that we're dealing with. I'm convinced that this is not going to be sufficient on the scale that most politicians are talking about, because we know the climate science data, because we know the impact. For example, there's a study by the Union of Concerned Scientists here in the US that it's called, I think it's called Underwater or something like that. This study from a couple of years ago, 2017, maybe 2018, estimated that the coastal properties in the US, hotels, resorts, businesses, housing, and all that, we're looking at $1 trillion of stranded assets, of actual lost property due to flooding by 2045. And they picked the year 2045 for a reason, because if you get a mortgage today for a property anywhere in coastal USA, the year 2045 is included in your mortgage. So that is a risk that you're actually taking by buying a property right now. And if you're an insurance company insuring that property, that's a risk that you're taking. If your bank is issuing a loan, a mortgage loan, that's a risk on your books. So this is just coastal properties, right? We're not talking about all the other consequences of climate change globally in terms of stranded assets and infrastructure and agriculture. So we're talking about trillions of dollars worth of potential losses within the next 2 to 3 decades that are happening, guaranteed, right? So that's the cost of doing nothing, right? The cost of doing the right thing is to build the new infrastructure, the green infrastructure that will mitigate these risks and literally save our lives. So that's what we're talking about, and it's not sufficient just to have the US do it, or Canada, or Japan, or South Korea. It needs to be everybody, including the global South. And that's why I argue for climate and colonial reparations, which include transfer of financial resources to the global South as reparations, but also transfer of technology and know-how to actually accelerate the decarbonization globally and to repair the broken structures from colonialism and neocolonialism. So if you're interested, I think somebody dropped the link to Macro and Cheese podcast where I explain this. There's other resources. Happy to share more if you reach out.
Yes, you have lots of radical information on MMT.
Radical is going to the roots of the problem.
That's right. Radical information on macro and cheese. And you and Simbacilla, Ndongo Simbacilla, do an excellent job. And all people have to do is go to macro and cheese. And since I know you are people-centered, and that's where my heart and my head is all the time. Susan had a question and she said, assuming the wealthy and those in power and the politicians understand how the economy works, because they do know, and how everything is really paid for, why then do they deprive us of basic life necessities like healthcare, like housing, and everything that goes along with it?
Yeah, very good question. So I will not assume that they know what I just explained here. I see people posting saying greed, greed, greed. Yes, there's some of that, certainly. There is corruption, certainly. There is power, certainly. but I'm willing to give some of them the benefit of the doubt in the sense that they're truly ignorant, and I see Dave here posting ignorance too, that they're truly ignorant of the way the system works. They truly believe that we need tax revenues and we need, borrowing capacity to spend, and beyond that limit we can't really spend, because all the mainstream economists have told us, the smart guys from Harvard and MIT and Chicago, they all told us for decades, if we spend more, if we have big deficits, we're going to bankrupt the country, we're going to have hyperinflation, and that's just, uncharted territory. We shouldn't go there. I mean, some of those people are still talking today, right? Larry Summers and Olivier Blanchard and all these people say, oh, $1.9 trillion is going to cause hyperinflation, it's going to overheat the economy. Those are the real reasons. I think the problems are in the economics profession and those elite schools with conservative economists, fiscally conservative economists, who perpetuate this idea. So I'll give some politicians the benefit of the doubt that they're relying on economists who are actually telling them you shouldn't do it because it's going to cause inflation. But there are others in Congress who actually understand this, who heard the MMT presentations, who heard this work, but they see it as a threat to their power, the power of the lobbyists and corporations that support their campaigns. Look at healthcare, for example. Very clear in the US that 70 plus, maybe 80% from the polling numbers that we have, support Medicare for all. Who are the people who oppose it? It's mostly politicians in DC, they're lobbyists, they're super PACs and the media companies that spin their stories. These are a minority, but they happen to be very influential. So that's what we're talking about. You can talk MMT all day, but the health insurance companies are not going to like it, because the obvious explanation, the obvious implication of MMT is saying we don't need a lot of middlemen charging individuals in the private sector premium and not delivering healthcare. And when people lose their jobs, they get no benefits, like during the pandemic, for God's sake, right? We have millions of people with no health insurance coverage because of the system we have in place. So I think a combination of all of those factors explains why we're in this situation.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I'm going to respect your time. This will be the last question. And if folks want to stick around, we can do that. The last question comes from Tarek, and he says, if MMT opens horizons for more spending, how do we account for the fact that the economy is not an isolated system, meaning that any additional spending takes energy and materials from outside and produces waste and depletes resources? In this sense, how do you see the intersection between concepts like degrowth and steady state economic growth with MMT?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, one of the things that I didn't get a chance to cover here is what I argue should be a component of the Green New Deal investment, which is massive investment in research and development, especially material science research. So for example, yes, we want to decarbonize and have plenty of solar panels and wind energy. The technology that we currently have is good, but not good enough in the sense that we can build more capacity, but that requires also quite a bit of mining for materials that will be the input for those solar panels. That's quite a bit of ecological damage. A lot of it will be in the global south. But also, we don't even know what to do with those solar panels in 30, 40 years when they become obsolete, meaning all that poisonous stuff in them. Where is it going to go? Landfills? That's going to be a huge problem. So we need to invest research and development resources. And I believe we can solve these technical problems, these technological problems, if we commit to it, if we set it as a priority. So we need to figure out how to reintroduce those materials in what we call the circular economy. And I think this is what you're hinting at with your comment on degrowth and zero growth and the circular economy. In other words, I want to have an economy, a society in which every time I buy a product from a store and it comes in a little box with a user manual, I want the user manual to include a living will for that product that says, this is how you dispose of me once you're done with this item. Which means not only do we have to say what we're going to do with that item to reintroduce it to the circular economy, but we also have to build the infrastructure to actually create that circular economy, to recycle all the components and all the products, and do it with energy efficiency, and to do it in a sustainable, ecologically sustainable way. So that's another component that obviously didn't have a chance to lay out in today's presentation. So the best place, the best framework, I think, for us to think about that circular economy, that truly effective Green New Deal system, is to start with Kate Raworth's book, which is called The Donut Economics. You can check out her TED Talk or some of her presentations online. It's a fantastic framework that truly puts sustainability at the center of everything that we do, because we don't operate in an economic vacuum. We operate in a social context, in an ecological context, and these are the real limits for our society. So the reference earlier to shifting from GDP to GPI, that's completely consistent with the framework that Kate Raworth and other ecological economists have laid for us. So there's plenty of blueprints, and we know what to do. It's just the commitment of political commitment, and the long-term vision and the spending is not happening in the right direction yet. And this is really what we're fighting for.
Fadhel, thank you
Thank you.
so much.